So anyway, we're in a world where central bankers are having trouble inflating. I just calculated the simple average of the US, the EU, Japan, and China. And it's about 0.5% per annum. And of course, I would imagine, for any Brazilian or Argentine, even Israeli, it's just puzzling, because I think you can pick any 6 random Brazilians and put them at any central bank, and I guarantee you, I used to think they would inflate, but I'm no longer so sure. In some emerging markets, however, we seem to find inflation in the sort of 5 to 8% range, including some big ones, like Brazil at like 7.5, going down. India just down with the fantastic work of Raghu Rajan, 5-ish. Russia has had pretty high inflation for quite some time. South Africa and Turkey. So most of the large ones have this inflation. And now we have Argentina coming down after a wild ride with inflation at the margin looking quite low, so I don't know, 15%, something like that. So one lesson we learned studying inflation in our region in particular is that these moderate inflations are not so easy to fight. And the main reason seems to be that informal or formal mechanisms of inertia and indexation are to be found in most of these places. In Brazil, we have a very long history, and is slightly different than the one you have here. In Brazil, we never dollarized, and we went the route of indexation, in part by design, in the early 60s. And the key feature of this was that we, in a way, institutionalized a system of formal, backward-looking inflation, and it's created a habit that is quite hard to shake. It didn't happen in a vacuum, and here we also have to ask the question: what was going on elsewhere in the economy, in particular in the macroeconomy? And I think is pretty clear that we had, throughout our very long history of high and hyperinflation, a very weak macroeconomic regime. We used to refer in the old days to, and this I think was also, maybe was imported from Argentina, as monetary policy being passive and accommodating. And we still see quite a bit of that. It wasn't just that. In the case of Brazil, we also had a very chaotic fiscal regime with multiple budgets. And as we all know, if you have more than one budget, you have none. So we had a federal government budget, we had a monetary budget. There were implicit budgets in at the state and local level. Each state in Brazil had a bank. Each state in Brazil controlled the power distribution company. All those were pockets of spending room, and not surprisingly, we've also had quite a bit of trouble through our history. There were many attempts at disinflating, and we were going through them as you were here in Argentina. The same with Israel. In the early days, there was just traditional monetary policy tightening. The results were very frustrating. We always ended up with modest results as far as inflation was concerned, and however, a very high social cost. We figured out that was not a good approach, and we moved to kind of non-orthodox plans that attempted to get rid of inertia and indexation, using price freezes frequently, the exchange rate as well, and all kinds of social pacts with also pretty clear mediocre results. And the issue there was that we went to the other extreme. We left out the fundamental kind of monetary fiscal dimension. In our case, after each attempt, inflation kept on climbing. So there was some learning. In particular, the indexation intervals started to shrink, but the crucial issues were not addressed. In the final stages of this strange story or history, we ended up with hyperinflation and also with about a decade of balance of payments issues. Brazil was in default as we went through hyperinflation. Brazil was also in default of its foreign debt. Finally, in 1994, the Real Plan put it all together. Things worked out well this time with the help of tight monetary policy. And it lasted longer, in a way. It's kind of lasting until today, but not without quite a lot of work. And I think often people leave that out. In our case, the exchange rate played a key role, as did monetary policy. But there were some issues. The fiscal side never kicked in. And once inflation went down, and it went way down quite fast, other problems appeared. So we had a sequence of post-Real Plan crises, and they came in the following order. First, we had a banking crisis, and we were kind of lucky. We had it at a moment where it was still before the Asia crisis. There was, as you know, a famous balance of payments and banking sort of event. So Brazil had a banking crisis early. The central bank reacted well, but the problem was our banking system, after decades with higher hyperinflation, was really an inflation parasite. And when inflation disappeared, a lot of banks found themselves with unsustainable cost structures and so on. So that one was managed pretty well. And then as we moved along, another couple of years, we had a combination FX fiscal crisis. It was textbook. Everybody knew it was coming, but not much was done, and until it actually happened. As we got close to it, and this was to former President Cardoso's eternal credit, he committed to a fiscal adjustment. He did it before the elections. He ended up winning his re-elections, which was a good thing, because afterwards he was able to deliver. And the issue for us at that point, and here there's some similarity with what you have here in Argentina now, in many ways. The issue was inflation. And I speak a little more. I'll speak a little bit more about this. Was the part that I personally lived through, and the fear was tremendous because we were afraid that we would go back to indexation. If inflation stayed high for long enough, it would have been very hard not to see that happen. Just to give you a sense, in early 1999. Inflation expectations were in a range between 20 and 50%. So all of it very unpleasant. Even the lower part of the range would probably have led us back to indexation. The exchange rate was overshooting a bit, and the economy was collapsing, and growth expectations at that point were at around 4%. There was a consensus that would have been the case, and we therefore had to do something, and we decided at that point that we did not want to go back to any kind of exchange rate anchor. We had too long a history of failure with that. The monetary aggregates as we all knew at that time, were not a practical instrument or mechanism. In Brazil, like everywhere else, as Chuck Friedman from Canada famously said, we didn't abandon the monetary aggregates; they abandoned us. So we didn't feel we had an option there either. So we decided to do inflation targeting, and you may recall, these were the days of Alan Greenspan at the Fed, and the whole world was mesmerized by his central banking skills, with very, very fascinating ways of analyzing things, going, bottom up and so on. And we decided, at this point I was there, I was asked to take on the job. I said, we need something that doesn't require Alan Greenspan. So my proposition, and I was hired with this package. So I said, fine, I'm happy to take the job, but I have a few conditions. They are, one, that the fiscal adjustment really does take place, and they said, no problem, it's happening, trust me. Second is that we were going to float the exchange rate, which we had never done. And then third, that as a result, we needed something. It would use inflation targeting in the spirit of what was being done at the time at the Bank of England, at the Bank of Sweden, Canada, New Zealand, mainly those. And we thought of it as something that it was very simple. I mean, what we tried to do is basically to tell people, if inflation is going up, we're going to tighten. If it's going down, we're going to cut, period. And we'll do as best as we can. We'll use all the tools we can. We'll listen to all of you. You can run all your models. We're going to run ours. You can use qualitative data. It doesn't matter. But it's very simple. We're going to look at inflation. So it's simple, like Charlie Brown and Lucy, if you remember. And Charlie Brown was a pitcher, and he had all these fancy pitching tools. And Lucy would say, Charlie Brown, no. When I go like this, fastball. I go like this, curveball. Forget about everything else. So this is basically all we did. And he would always say, but I have a sinker, said Charlie Brown. Look at this, fastball, this. And it actually worked pretty well, I must say. I also, at the time, being one of the nice things about having this job, as Federico is now enjoying, and I did as well, and many colleagues here, Stefan, Guillermo, Ragu, is you get to hang out with this central banking world of people who really mean well, and they really want to do well, and they know that what they do is really important. Particularly for the people, as we know, particularly for the poor people. And so they're given this task, and they get to talk. So at that point, I actually had a chance to run into Paul Volcker, who, of course, requires no introduction. He's a giant in every sense of the word, including he's being very, very tall. He's about 2 meters tall. So I asked Paul, I said, Paul, what do you think of inflation targeting? And he said, his inimitable way. I hope he's not watching. Well, I don't like inflation. I don't like deflation. I guess I like flation. So, okay, here we are looking at flation. And that's what we did. But the thing is, we didn't really know where to peg it. We were afraid, with all the expectations all over the place, that we picked the wrong target, and it would be too easy or too tight, and it would kind of, in a way, we would waste, a chance of anchoring. So, in many ways, we follow the path that I believe you're following here, which is a gradual approach. We announced in the beginning of the year that we would pick a target 3-4 months later in June, and that we wanted inflation to be running at the margin at annualized single-digit rates at the end of the year. And that's basically what we did. In our case, we were going through a major confidence shock. It's a little bit different here in a way, because it was a change in the political. There was a political change. There were elections, and like what we're going through, which is also another kind of change. And so it really was an issue. There was a credibility issue that we had to deal with. So we beefed up the support on the balance of payment side, thinking that would be sort of a soft anchor, working with the IMF and going around the world, trying to explain to people what it is that we were doing and why we believed we had a chance. So thus was born the so-called, in Brazil, tripé, the tripod of fiscal responsibility. We soon voted in a very important fiscal responsibility law that survived quite a few years. It's a little shaky at the moment, but hopefully it will survive. Inflation targeting and a floating exchange rate. So that was the way we did it. There's a lot of detail I won't bore you with. I fully realized I'm the one standing here between you and lunch, so I will try to pick up some speed. But anyway, this has lasted, has done us well, and even recently with a tremendous loss in macroeconomic discipline we've seen in Brazil, particularly fiscal, I'd say it's still working pretty well. So what do we do? And now, in particular, what do we do with these sort of moderate inflations? Now, here I think I completely agree with my two predecessors here, Karnit and Jose, and I know if Guillermo also joined us in this panel, he would say something similar. I think you need a combination of things. I'm convinced now that there is no panacea. There's nothing. Inflation targeting is quite good, but it won't work unless it is supported by other aspects of policy, in particular the fiscal. So I think one needs to build a strong macro regime, and I believe there's nothing more important than having a sound fiscal regime in place. And this is what Brazil is trying to rebuild right now, and I also understand there are similar issues here in Argentina. And I think similarly, it makes sense to make sure you have a sound financial sector. That's the breeding ground for expectations, for bubbles and runs and so on. So that I think is a good important lesson, as Pepo said, that we learn the hard way. I believe also that some degree of gradualism is appropriate in this sort of circumstance. This is not a hyperinflation where the synchronicity exists. You've seen prices converge, and you can almost go to the second derivative. The first derivative is moving along, and you can fix it. With moderate inflations, or moderate to low, as we're seeing in many of these countries, it's much harder. There's not much one can do about indexation, quite frankly, other than perhaps lead by example, if you're in the government. But anyway, these are complicated political economy issues. I also fully subscribe to the view of being somewhat asymmetric and being, therefore, opportunistic. When things don't quite work, it seems you can generate some degree of social cohesion and do things. When there's a supply shock, terms of trade shock, something like that, or other issues, you can muster the political will to respond. When things are going well, it's easy to then kind of enjoy the fruits. But I'd say if you still have some inflation, you want to get rid of it, by all means be opportunistic. If you have a positive shock, go for it. We missed the big one in Brazil with the terms of trade. I actually think Argentina as well. We went together. We rode the terms of trade cycle. It was good fun, but we didn't do much with it, quite frankly. We should not forget that. So should we run into another favorable wind, knock inflation down a little bit more. And lastly, I am also completely convinced that one has to do something about expectations. I'm in Guillermo Calvo's camp. I've been both, actually, Guillermo Ortiz's as well, about this forward guidance thing. Forget about it. It's very easy to lose your credibility doing this kind of thing. But I do think there's something else one can do. It's also hard to do, but very worthwhile. And that is also have a vision of kind of where you want the economy to go. Which includes all kinds of, call it, microeconomic reforms. And I can assure you, in the case of Brazil, there are a million things to be done. Some of the problems were man-made, some had been there historically, it doesn't matter. Fix them. And I think if you do that, you get a lot. You get, first of all, probably a nice productivity kick. And this what am I talking about? Tax reform, trade reform, infrastructure growth through proper regulation so you can attract capital, very basic stuff. And you get a nice supply side kick, which, trust me, I think is a wonderful thing if you're at the central bank. There's nothing better. So you can create your own supply shock if you do the micro policies. And I think that's very, very important to be done. And moreover, I do think it creates a feeling of progress, the feeling that things are working, and it helps deal with expectations, quite frankly. Because if you can have that on your side, I think it is a must that you try at least. I think there's no better way to do it than having sort of a game plan and then putting it to work as best as you can. Anyway, that's what I had. Appreciate being here. Thanks for bearing with me.
We are now going to open the panel to questions and answers. Two speakers of this panel, Bringing Down Inflation, Theory and Practice, moderated by the Director of the Central Bank of Argentina. Please raise your hands so that we may hand you the mic. Enrique Alberola from BIS. When your countries embarked in bringing down inflation, the world was different, as Guillermo and Arminio said. There was more inflation. Many countries were entering deflation. Now there is no inflation in advanced nations and in some emerging nations. So do you think it's easier, the process for a country like Argentina, or more difficult, or is it the same?
I actually think the issues that we had to deal with in our inflation, and I think that the fact that you have actually imported either deflation or very low prices make it easier. I think there is one other element that makes it easier here is the fact that you don't have system taxation that was, at least in our case, was part of what brought in inertia, which was more difficult to get rid of. So in that sense, I think there are at least two conditions that should make it easier and maybe make it possible to do a speedier process than at least what we had to deal with in the 90s.
Yes.
I agree that imported inflation is quite favorable, also coupled with the fact of what is going on with the exchange rate. Imported inflation will depend on what is going on not only with prices abroad, but with parities. And the weakness of our economies vis-à-vis the strength of the U.S. economy, how this will bear an impact. What is also unfavorable is that there are no tailwinds in the world economy that will allow implementing stringent adjustments. But with a higher cruise speed, that is what will make things more difficult, but not impossible. Any other question? I will abuse my role as moderator and ask the next question. Karnit mentioned the sacrifice ratio. In your experience so far, what are the things that a central bank can do to improve the sacrifice ratio in this disinflation process?
No sé quién quiere.
I don't know who wants to answer first.
No, ese es un punto muy importante porque
He said he was going to speak English, but he started speaking Spanish.
I love Spanish. It's a fantastic language, and I just don't speak it very well. Maybe with a glass of wine. No, I think it's very important that not only the point that I think both of my colleagues made about a stable environment brings more growth, but we can do some smoothing. And I think it's making that clear helps. We can, if your economy is hit by a big supply shock, you don't have to fix it overnight. You can take your time and do it over a little while. I think that's also good. It's dangerous because, of course, the notion that you can do some smoothing often leads to the notion that you can eliminate the business cycle, which I then think creates some strange, may have some strange consequences. But I think that's a good one. I don't like the remit that the Fed has. It works for them, but I do think in the end the central bank has to be clear that we're talking smoothing, not creating faster growth beyond the benefits of stability. But I think the smoothing works well.
Yeah. One thing is really to use favorable shocks with the opportunistic approach, and that I think reduces, you can move forward with lower sacrifice ratio. But I also think that during the disinflation, in a way, if you take very long time, it means that you don't gain the credibility fast enough, and that by itself, I think, sort of prolong the process and raises the sacrifice ratio. So I think you do have to be focused and sort of demonstrate that you mean business, and then I think the process is shorter, you gain credibility faster, and in a way it is also, it means lower, it means maybe pain, but for shorter. I think that's part of the deal.
No,
I basically agree. There is a tension, which is the stronger you go, the more credibility you gain, and the better it is for the long run. The more gradual you go, sometimes it's more difficult to gain credibility. But that has to be realistic, and I think that otherwise, I think that there is something in between, and I wouldn't say to minimize the sacrifice ratio, but at least to pay not excessive cost without thinking that this is free, because it is not free.
Muy bien, continuamos entonces con la siguiente consulta.
We move on to the next question. I had a question about the level of inflation targets. In the developed world, there is a discussion whether 2% may be too low. Blanchard, for example, says that maybe a higher one should be used. Here at the Central Bank of Argentina, the inflation target is 5% plus minus 2%. So I would like to know whether you have any comment about the developed world and the inflation targets in the developed world and how that may or may not apply to emerging economies, whether there is any argument to set any specific level. Your countries, for example, have different goals.
Distinta.
The discussion is very... The discussion is...
Inflación.
They
say that it's a 4% inflation, but why 4%? Because we have 4 points to lower the rate to get to zero lower bound. In our case, in the case of Chile, we have 3% inflation target plus 1 point of risk premium, so you have a 4% rate. So the spaces exist, there is room still. And personally, I have a big doubt, and somebody was saying this in the previous session in forward guidance. I understand that you may say that the optimum is 4% inflation rate. Now the question is, how do you get to that 4%? Japan has tried for 20 years, and it seems that, I don't know what the mechanism is, I don't know whether it is efficient, I don't know if it is something that can be achieved, because truly speaking, many countries have tried and have not attained it. I'm not very sure. I'm not either. I'm not sure. Anybody else? Ricardo Diesi from Citibank and University of La Plata. In Argentina, the banks are not working as banks. No se escucha, ¿ves? ¿No? Transactions and loans are made to the private sector against GDP is 13 points and the average is 42. So given that reconstruction, explosive reconstruction in terms of mismatches in currencies and rates, with the international rate in 0 or 20 years, the inflow capital should be fast enough, considering the gap that exists, which causes an explosion of mismatches. Do you think that this can be applied to inflation target?
It's good but dangerous, I think. It's not like the terms of trade, in my view, because this is affecting the terms of trade between consumption now and in the future, rather than the terms of which you can sell your goods, which are those are really good. So this one, and moreover, who knows how long it will last. But yeah, I think it's good. But do something with it, no? Don't just enjoy it and get fat.
¿Tenemos otra pregunta?
Do we have another question? My name is Beatriz Nofal. A question for Arminio and Gregorio. Do you think that as former governors of central banks of Chile and Brazil, do you think that a more formal dialogue between Argentina and Brazil with Chile at the table and focused on disinflation could help to provide or to give credibility to the monetary policy for disinflation?
But that's why we're here.
Sí, pero en la gestión también digo, no digamos.
But I mean in the formal mechanisms. Mercosur has a dialogue, but occasionally it meets and with more public results, I mean.
Exists at an academic level. There's a lot of dialogue. And it would have to be within Mercosur, which right now has an extreme case up north that we need to deal with. But yeah, I think so. There's something called SEMLA that meets regularly at the central banking level, where a lot of this is discussed. I think it's a good idea. I don't think it would, in itself, do much more than kind of gathering the facts. In the end, all these are really domestic fights, but it wouldn't hurt.
Los presidentes Banco Central de Mercosur se reúnen.
Mercosur central bank governors meet regularly and there is a significant dialogue. Sharing experience is also useful, but inflation control is more of a domestic problem. It's not so much related to trade and other matters. It can be useful, but it's not going to be key. Just a brief comment to Ricardo's question. The Central Bank of Argentina has very strong restrictions to currency mismatches that will not be modified or released or freed. So there could be external financing, but the restriction regarding the use of those funds by banks will continue to be restrictive as they have been regarding cash reserves. And in 2001, Argentina did not allow for that currency mismatch. And that has to do with fear of floating. That is a lesson that we have learned. We have time for one more question. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Regardless of the opinion that we may have regarding the independence of central banks, particularly in inflation control matters, attempting to have only a monetary policy to control inflation, I believe, is not sufficient. And our experience, I come from Bolivia, and our experience in Bolivia has been a combination between the central bank and other levels of the executive branch to be able to control inflation. And I have myself managed for many years the non-monetary actions for controlling of inflation, because there are cyclic times as to the supply of the market, agriculture output, and that also causes fluctuations in prices. Therefore, those supply cycles could be more structural or less structural per se, but they are not solved by monetary policy alone. Therefore, there is a need to establish a mechanism of coordination with the executive agency on this matter and other types of matters. I think that is essential, and I would like to know about your opinion.
Hay una diferencia y me parece.
I think there is a difference. We have a problem in Chile, the fuel price problem. In Chile, we have the fuel price fluctuations of relative prices, and this is not the inflation that the monetary policy is concerned about. Of course, you have the food, for example, price fluctuations. You can try to stabilize prices. These are relative prices, but ultimately, the level of inflation, whether it will be 10 or 30 or 5%, it is something that the monetary policy will set.
You can have significant fluctuations in prices and actually in inflation at an annual level. And at least in our case, as I mentioned, in the law, we have 24 months to get inflation back to the target level. We're not trying to correct for price level changes. We're not looking backwards, but we're looking forwards. And I think the important thing about inflation targeting is that there is credibility that you are going to get back into the inflation target level within a certain period of time. But you will have fluctuations in the inflation level, and that's fine as long as you have credibility in getting it back to the target level.
Arminio, you're good?
Okay, Karnit, Jose, and Arminio, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.